this feels a bit like group therapy over and over again. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's a good thing all in all for the mental health of most of us here. And perhaps everyone who's watching as well, So Tara and Vakasha, thank you so much for joining us. I have to do the introductions again, maybe, or just assume that it's already done on YouTube and we don't have to, on Facebook, and we won't have to repeat it for now. That said, for the next hour and a half, we're going to be talking about a recently passed, dearly departed, fondly remembered judge of the American Supreme Court. Now, there are many reasons why we can ask ourselves why we're interested in her and her life. And our own philosophy with Just Learning is that, it's nice to look elsewhere to sort of remember who we are and why we do what we do. I can't think of a better reason why it's worth looking over her life and asking ourselves what we're doing today. So we have Tara, Narula and Vakasha Sachdev, who are both extremely competent people on this matter and several other matters. We are going to be focused predominantly on trying to understand how to understand RBG's life in the context. I'm going to call her RBG for the sake of my dignity and pronunciation skills, at least for the rest of this conversation. We'll start with a brief introduction of on why we picked the name that we did, most of us here, I hope it's not a dictatorial imposition, but we really like hip hop. And the Notorious B.I.G. is a very famous hip hop artist who passed away much too early, And I'm happy to say that RBG at least survived for as long as she did and did as much as she did. And not much of it is as easy to understand ourselves. And I'm really quite excited for this episode in particular. So this exercise is supported by three broad initiatives. The first is Just Learning, where we think of ourselves as a media-first projects company. This is what we want to tell venture capitalists. But don't worry, we're never going to take money from venture capitalists. But if we do, this is what we're going to call ourselves. The second, we have Gathr, where we design human interactions and build communities. We think that's the most important civic responsibility one could ever have. And we don't think that all answers necessarily lie in the law itself. And really, it's more about thinking about how we can design civics for humanity through stuff that makes us want to jump up and down, at least sit quietly and ponder, And the third is the Garden City Legal Hackers. Legal Hackers is a global community with over 180 chapters around the world. We hold the charter to Bangalore's this one. There's actually no holding and charter as such involved. Anyone who wants to participate can. We just call ourselves the Garden City Legal Hackers. It's an initiative which is meant to bring lawyers, technology designers, everyday citizens who are invested in making people participate in this process. And we'd urge you gently as we can to join us in remaking what we think of as our circumstances. Nothing really more than that at this moment. Anyway, now that we've done all the things that I'm going to be later, I hope this time around you've been warned. Usually our guests end up being a bit surprised with this question, but we want to ask you how you would introduce yourself without talking about what you do and where you're from. So Tara, let's start with you and go to Vakasha, and then let's get into the meat of our conversation.
Okay, so I guess I'm not much of a talker, but I basically have three words to describe myself, I think. One would be feminist. Another would be foodie, and the third is more like a phrase. It's to be determined. So I think I don't really know where I'm going from here and so on, but I like to think I have tendencies towards the law, towards like acting and performance and things like that. And that's how I would like to introduce myself.
Okay, this is it's quite a profession you've picked for yourself. I'm the first person to tell you this, but in any case, let it be on record that as a foodie and feminist, you ought to be in the Supreme Court. And I'm very glad you're practicing law, this stuff. And as for the third phrase, we should just say TBD, because otherwise we sound like we don't really quite get the rules of saying three words when we describe ourselves. But thank you for coming here.
TBD is what I meant to say.
Oh yeah, now we'll PTO so that we can move on to the next next segment of our conversation. But this is just about to say that, at least internally, we don't think of feminism as such as anything which can be clearly distinguished from humanism and basic courtesy towards most of our population. It's such a pity that we have to have a philosophical anchoring to it. But I think it's really urgent that we do. So thanks for self-identifying as such. We ourselves are proud feminists. Vakasha, do you want to say and talk about all your pet peeves on live camera?
Well, I mean, that would take up all the time here, but let's just say I'm someone who, I think I describe myself as someone who is very geeky and nerdy. I would like to try and find a way to make that kind of, let me do something more with my life. I think because I started off in a very, very different vein. I was very, I had certain ideas of how one has to, go about life and the kinds of things one has to do. With the standard things we're always fed from the time we're kids about career and all of that. And, I realized eventually that I'd rather be doing things which I actually really care about, things which speak to my own interests, my own strengths. And as I said, given that I'm quite geeky, quite nerdy, very in complete opposition to Tara, I love talking, as you might have already observed in the last minute. And I think, putting all those things together with the fact that I did, and I do love writing. And so that's sort of, it tells you kind of exactly what I might be doing and why I'm here. And that's sort of, I guess, where I am. I mean, I'm also, it's very difficult. This is very, very tough and very weird question to ambush people with. Badri, so next time give a heads up. But yeah, I mean, also foodie, foodie, nerd, geek, loves to talk. I think that probably sums up a lot of things here. And someone who's very, 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 very.
I would say.
Sorry?
No, I was about to say that it sums up everything that I know about you. I was about to say that talking too much is a problem that afflicts all of mankind. And when I say mankind, I mean specifically men and male people, And so I suppose we'll figure out how to tone ourselves down over the course of this conversation, if nothing else. But that said, I have to say, I am super inspired by the career choices you've made. None of the choices you've made have either been obvious or easy. And to stick up for what you believe in is really more important than everything else. If anything, I trust nerds with conviction, and integrity. So thanks for being a nerd as well. So with the formalities of the way, let me set the ground for the first question that we'll sort of get into before we get into the rest of the conversation. And all of this said, I just want to remind you guys and also ourselves that, the value of media that is slow and deliberate cannot be overstated, especially because it's become too easy to consume media without putting much thought into it. So we're very happy for the conversation to go quite slowly. So don't feel quite rushed. We have a lot of time today. And if anything, we're anyway going to be reorganizing all of this as questions that we can sort of mull over deeply over a period of time, So, and they'll be available as playlists on our channel at some point in time. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, at some point in the near future. So anyway, so coming to the first question. So I want to ask both of you today, why you find RPG interesting? What is it that got you to think about whether you wanted to participate today or not, beyond the fact that you're very nice people and wanted to do this for the sake of us? We really respect that. But what is interesting to you about RPG? And perhaps we can sort of unpack that and get into the rest of our conversation. Tara, shall we start with you again? You want to go first?
There were a couple of things. So I'm part of a lawyers group, which is called the Delhi High Court Women Lawyers Association. So I had nothing but sort of positive associations with RBG. And then there was a semi-heated discussion on the group, of which I was not a part, but I was a spectator, which problematized her becoming an icon, so to speak, and her sort of career and life story and its propagation in media in different countries as sort of the pinnacle of achievement and that sort of thing. So that got me really interested in RBG for the first time, actually. So that was my engagement with RBG is really recent in that sense, after her death, certainly. And I think more broadly, I've always kind of been intrigued by people that are put on pedestals, because I think it leads to like so much disappointment, but at the same time, there is value to it, of course, which is why we're doing this session. So I think just putting some of these things out there in context, discussing the problems with icons and people on pedestals, and specifically with RBG, that's what drew me to the session today.
Okay, I think the broader problem of how we think about icons is something we cannot ignore in any civic society. And, it's very easy for us to turn back to finding the flaws of our heroes. And, I really think it's useful for civic discourse. But to not talk about it at all, I don't know if it's really very useful. And I'd like to think of the purpose of this conversation, at least to understand the contours of a character, not really to think of her as anything but a human being who lived and breathed as she thought was appropriate and right. And thanks for prefacing the conversation that we're going to have in this manner, Tara. Vakasha, you want to talk about RBG? How do you feel about what drew you to this conversation today?
I think for me, I mean, she's always been an interesting person, and obviously, because to some extent we do consume a lot of sort of American media. And this was something which in particular, when I was working abroad, I kind of did consume a lot more of it back then as well. I think, given her kind of status as a sort of cultural icon in the US, that was something which kind of became something which one was aware of. In time with the kind of work which I've been doing, which is essentially looking at the Supreme Court and looking at how it's progressing, looking at the kind of decisions making, the kind of impacts those are having, I think she became an even more interesting character to look at, because the US Supreme Court is a fascinating area for us to look at when we're trying to examine our court and the role it's playing here as well. And for me, I found what was fascinating was that Ginsburg was someone who was becoming part of two very important debates. One was the question of whether this concept that they have there now of conservative versus liberal justices, of having such a clear demarcating line in your court, that people are openly talking about that. Given in India, we don't really have that kind of analysis, even though we have so many judges at the court. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of her, which we are seeing more and more, that we can kind of analyze a lot of judgments of the Supreme Court here as well from those kind of lenses, even though that's something which has traditionally been frowned on. And the other aspect was, of course, that she just kind of seemed like a really badass kind of person. Like if you see any of her videos with people, she was someone who seemed, she was obviously, because of the role of being a Supreme Court judge, she's very, she is someone who's serious, she's important, like, she's the kind of stuff she's doing, and yet she came across in such a relatable kind of human way. And you see those videos of her doing workouts with Stephen Colbert and all that. I mean, she was someone who just seemed very, very fascinating. And obviously there was the concerns over her potentially of her health over the years. And that's obviously something which has now come to pass, which is, I think, again, gives us an important conversation to have, which perhaps relates to India as well. So that's why I was very, very keen to get in on this conversation here. Thank you for obviously bringing me on board. But
Badri?
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. I was just about to say, with both Vakasha and Tara right now, I'm noticing that our professional orientation to how to think towards how we think about her morality is really like seeping into this conversation, So I want to ask how you think we can think about RBG in the context of India, because there are many ways in which we can look at our Supreme Court right now. There's been a lot of talk about the idea that we live in a country where the court often seems to do what the government wants it to do. It's not very clear when the judiciary is free and when it's not free. We've seen the use of judicial powers which have been cast as being the overly circumstances and the lenses that you're wearing. So can I ask both of you, and Tara, you could go first this time again, talking about how you think of her as a lawyer and how you think of the parallels of her, of the dimensions of a character in the context of the debates that we're seeing in India, the prevailing debates in India. I would say maybe we can start talking about perhaps how we think about the role of the judiciary and specifically the role of a woman in legal practice. So perhaps in other places.
Yeah. Um, so there's a lot here. So it's not just one thing, but I'll just say what maybe we can come back once more on this question later. But I think what resonates with me about RBG and thinking about her as a lawyer is that in many of her judgments, I find we speak the same language. So the bottom line, the baseline is the same, which is not actually the case all the time. And it is something that I struggle with in court a lot, which is, you say something to a judge, which you think is a given or is obvious, and it just isn't. So an example of this from her career, which I read about, was I forget, it was one of her cases where she was arguing against sex-based discrimination, and the judge said, "Oh, is it not enough to put so and so on the dollar bill?" And it was, I suppose, a joke, or I don't know what it was, but it would be so disheartening to stand there as a female lawyer and be talking about a very important sex discrimination issue, and then to be confronted with what is basically tokenism. And she didn't respond to that. And there are lots of debates over this temperament of hers, whether she should respond or whether, she should have shown more passion in some of the things that she did. She was famously known as a conciliator, she was friends with Scalia and so on. So I think one takeaway is that perhaps having a more representative Supreme Court, High Courts, etc., would mean that we could speak a common language somewhat more easily, a language of constitutionality always, of course, but also explaining something, including there was a case that she dealt with as a judge, in which a 13-year-old girl was strip searched, I think, for drugs, if I remember correctly. And the Supreme Court in the US held that was too much. And there were some dissenting opinions. There was a dissenting opinion, I believe, and she commented that, well, they don't know what it is to be a 13-year-old girl. So I often feel that way here as well. And I think that could be a takeaway. It's to work out a kind of common language, at least for the times that we live in.
Oh, absolutely. And can I ask you to extend the point a little further? Because, in trying to interpret what you're saying right now, I'm noticing that justice seems to have so much to do with timing. And it may or may not have been okay for RBG to speak up or not speak up when she could have. And there's this matter of how do we think about about the fact that she eventually got elevated to the Supreme Court because of the approach that she took, and these are very difficult choices to make, which I think most men don't have to make, and this is a point that you alluded to. Do you want to talk about how it plays up with you in your practice and how you think about, what it means to share a language that is more accepting of a non-male experience?
So it's so tough to put one's finger on it, actually, because things change so much. I think I would have been better placed to speak about this when I was starting out in practice, or a couple of years in practice, because I already don't, and I'm only I'm 33, but I already don't face the same issues that I did a little while back in communicating what I'm trying to say. I deal a lot with POXO cases, for example, which is child sexual abuse cases. And I mean, there are 24 courts, special courts in Delhi, and each one is varyingly different, in how they sort of approach victims. Their public prosecutors are different, their court staff is different in their approaches. So it's at every level that you sort of have to struggle to communicate basic languages of consent, for example, of agency, and also of temptation and lust, sadly, at times. So it is, I think...
I don't know, I feel super apologetic. Sorry, my bandwidth is a bit up and down, so I'm not sure when I'm interrupting you and when I'm not. But I hope this is not a terrible interruption. No, I was just about to say that this experience that you're alluding to, the idea that literally the experience is different from each other, seems so weird. And to most people who are non-lawyers, it would be almost bizarre that versions of justice can look different in different places. And I really think that might be a good point of arrival to ask Vakasha to reflect on. Vakasha, your experience working with female colleagues over the years in the legal industry, and I want to say industry because it's obviously not restricted just before the courts, and to see whether you want to draw any parallels to RBG, bring in the facts that we clearly need more of, and so forth. So, Vakasha, you want to take it from there and talk about what your experience of working with female colleagues, say from school when you were very active with the Model United Nations, subsequently in college, then when you worked in London, back in India. You've had, as I know, several amazing women bosses as well. So I'm very curious to hear how you would reflect of this idea of who appears before a legal forum, and also to think about what we can sort of learn from RBG.
Okay, I think we lost Badri a little bit there. Hello, should I go on at this point, or?
Yeah.
This
Okay.
context.
Yes,
please.
Right. I think what's been an interesting thing for me is that, as you pointed out, I've actually ended up having a lot of very, very interesting women bosses. The very first person who I worked for when I moved, when I started my first job, which was in London at that time at an international law firm, there was a woman associate. And what was fascinating to see was that, she was incredibly competent, incredibly hardworking. But what was interesting to see was that I could see that she even though we were in, and what was interesting was that was a department which actually had more women than men, and in fact quite a few senior women there as well. It was still interesting to see that she honestly, there were times when it was very clear that she was putting in a lot more effort than even she perhaps needed to at a particular thing, because of how much she knew this was something she kind of needed to do. I also worked with Shreya Rao in, when she started her own firm in Bangalore. And again, it was a great learning experience. And again, what was interesting there was that, she's she's easily, in terms of tax and private wealth, one of the leading lawyers in this country. And yet you could see that even she, she had obviously reached a level where now, when people, when she spoke, people were listening. But, there was this sense a lot of the time where I felt that even she still felt she was having to do more. And what was interesting was it wasn't just about necessarily the kind of things which we always talk about, you have to present yourself, in terms of being, in terms of the way she talked to people or to kind of put her point across. It was even other things as well, all the senior women lawyers, for instance, I knew, all talked about the need, and this was at law firms abroad and here, was this thing that, even though we may not find heels comfortable, we will wear the heels because it's part of, we have to kind of do it because it's kind of part of what we're kind of expected to do when we're trying to put ourselves out there as, professionally put together, serious looking people. And I found it quite baffling. But the thing is, it was something as simple as the fact that, unfortunately, men seem to take someone who's taller more seriously. It's absolutely silly kind of things, which actually end up playing a big role in this kind of thing. And it was it was quite a surreal thing, because I remember I've been on meetings with bosses who were wearing other shoes, and they would then switch to the heels before they went into the meeting. And these are people who are at the top of their game. They're as good as it gets. Everyone knows how good they are. And they still, unfortunately, because of the kind of environment which we've been creating, actually felt a need to do that. And I thought that was a very, very interesting thing. The great thing about working with, I found with women bosses, was that they're very, very clear about, making sure that you do the work. There's no, I've worked with male bosses where, there's been a bit of banter about football and things and all. I've honestly found that, when it came to a lot of the work one was doing, actually, a lot of those conversations could take over. Whereas, I found women bosses have been far more focused, far more clear about what they're doing, and which is very, very important, especially, for I think young people who are coming up and trying to work with people. I found that was actually a great learning experience for me. At the Quint, the CEO here, Ritu Kapoor, she's again someone who's been in media for a long time, and she's someone who's again been a great person to work with, because she doesn't dip her toes into the editorial side of things a lot. But one of the things which I've done to a large extent is look at issues of ensuring our compliance with legal things in terms of our rules and sensitivity for editorial content are there. So it's not just about the law, but also being more sensitive, and in that regard, Ritu has been incredibly good and an incredible person to work with on that side. So I mean, but what's interesting is that as I said, there are so many of these absolutely badass, completely brilliant women, and yet even in the middle of all the work they're doing, there are times when you can see they're taking certain steps which they're finding they need to still do because of the kind of uh, weird ideas that people have and expectations that people have in a lot of contexts, whether it's corporate or even in terms of editorial, some journalistic stuff as well.
Okay, this that's a very interesting point, Vakasha, because I've actually had the same experience with most of the women I have worked with. And I've worked, I would say, I've roughly worked with maybe 50-50% in terms of like sexual distribution, and really I'm finding that we have the privilege of working with people across gender and sexuality, right? So we have, to a certain extent, at least an understanding of an alternative experience. And a world where civics is as difficult as it is, I really think that the experience that you and I have had is a very, very privileged and a very rare one. And this is a really useful question to sort of pitch to Tara once again. Tara, I want to ask you how we should interpret RBG's conciliatory authority. I mean, how do you not get damn pissed off when this is happening? And how do you think about your role as a young lawyer right now and as an older lawyer as time passes? And obviously you're mentoring younger lawyers who are entering practice right now. So how do you think about it? And do you want to, if feel free to draw parallels from RBG's life as well, because I, for one, am not able to wrap my head around this. So Tara, if you want to go for this, it'll be interesting to hear your perspective.
Yeah. So RBG, I believe, said about her time in law school that there were just so many problems there that they were just kind of part of the scenery. And I'm guessing that gave her the preparation to go through life with being able to confront blatantly discriminatory or oppressive or subjugatory notions with equanimity. And I don't think that many of us would have the fortitude to do that. I think that is probably a special characteristic in her. One that I would love to inculcate for no other reason than to feel a bit zen at times, because it can get pretty hectic if you get emotionally involved and passionate about every single thing. I think all of you know what that's like for sure. So, I mean, I would imagine it's the way that she's been described forever. I mean, since she was in law school, etc. And this is the problem with trying to put her on a pedestal, with putting her on a pedestal, because then you have unrealistic expectations perhaps from her. And even if it's not an unrealistic expectation, maybe it was her personality. So I don't know how much one should just should break it down. But I think certainly that is an expectation of women in the profession, potentially of female judges as well. And I don't know how far a lot of passion would get you in this day and age, because, demonstrated passion. I think it has to be held, your cards have to be held closer to the chest, perhaps, would get you these days. Because I think one of the things that I advise my colleagues is just make friends, like make friends with the court staff, make friends with, the opposing counsel. Do it even if you hate doing it, because it's a faster way to get work done and get somewhere. And it's perhaps the way I like to see it, or explain to myself at least, is that we're all working towards becoming viruses in the system one day, and you just got to get there quickly and infect it quickly and then take over, hopefully. So that's how I kind of justify that behavior to myself when I have to quell my, my enthusiasm or beliefs or views. And of course, at times it's not
anger.
But yeah, anger, exactly.
I mean, one thing which I think.
Sorry, I mean, I don't know. See, anger is such a weird word to use. Vakasha, I was just about to ask Tara a follow-up that, and then if you want to go right after that, feel free to. I'll take bandwidth privileges because obviously I'm suffering from low bandwidth at this moment. But that said, Tara, I want to ask you one more question in this context. Specifically, I thought the point you were making about having friends very interesting. because having friends in a profession, as Vakasha pointed out, can also seem counterproductive, right? Because on one side, he was almost alluding to the idea that banter didn't help with being more serious about your work, finishing things on time, or being lax about things others don't necessarily have to be lax about. And I say others, I mean anyone with alternate gender, sexual identities, not necessarily just women, but anyone under the broad umbrella of femininity. And masculinity in India is such a weird thing because I don't think Indian men, and myself included, have yet figured out what it means to see ourselves clearly in the mirror and to look at another person and to be able to see them for what they are. So the question I wanted to ask you, Tara, is in the context of RBG, and you were speaking about her experience in law school, I found that to be very pertinent, and the idea that RBG could have either been sexy and famous or she had to be unsexy and conciliatory, and that's a crappy decision to make. It's a crappy choice to have to make for any human being. And so I understand where the anger might come from, but how can we inculcate an alternative imagination in law students of this day and age in India right now, borrowing from RBG's philosophy? And Vakasha, if you want to go right after Tara's response, feel free to do that. I'd love to hear your perspective on how we can inculcate this value better, because Vakasha, you and I went to some amazing places and we've had great access. I mean, this is not necessarily an attitude. Respecting dignity and constitutional values for their own sake is not necessarily something people are born into, but grow into and keep growing into, right? So Tara, you want to go first, and then Vakasha on the same idea?
I may kind of have lost track of the question, to be honest, but I'll tell you my thoughts.
No, I'm happy. I am worse than Vakasha when it comes to like rambling, and that's saying something. Sorry, Vakasha, I didn't want to say this on camera, but I've said it now. I was just about to say, I wanted to ask you, but
so
specifically,
let me before I forget my thoughts, can I say? So basically, I think one of the things is to create safe spaces, right? And I think a lot of that is now going on, and it has given me personally a lot of strength to be a part of a lot of groups, etc., which are safe spaces for doing what you want to do and the way you want to do it and saying what you want to say. And there are, of course, actual real world, women and men and others who are doing whatever the hell they want to do. And I think that would be ultimately, the more people that do that is how the contours of that space would get broader. So I don't think anybody has to quell themselves or suppress themselves, but probably we should all agree to just be ourselves.
Okay, no, I think that's a very fair agreement. Someone made this agreement for us in 1950 and called it the Constitution, but maybe one day we'll figure out what it means. But Tara, I want to push you a little further on that question, because I want to ask you specifically what you think a safe space looks like today in India, and I want to understand, I mean, like, there are so many informal networks right now, and there seems to be a price that is put on speaking the truth and speaking truth to power and so on and so forth. So I really want to understand what you mean by safe space, and what do you wish you had? What do you wish that RBG had, say, 50 years ago, or even right now in 2020? Because unfortunately, what seems to be happening, whether it's her or with Kamala Harris or with Nirmala Sitharaman, their antecedents and identity are questioned before their competence is questioned, and that's messed up, right? So I want to ask you a little more about what you wish the safe space looked like, and if you want to talk about specific features, feel free to.
I actually think Vakasha is going to answer this question much better than I would. But I suppose a safe space at present, if I'm being honest, just looks like your immediate circle. I mean, people that you can really trust. Depends on the work that you do, I suppose, and how the space that you occupy in the world. Maybe your safe space is broader if you're, I don't know. I don't know when your safe space is broader, but I think the way that some of us experiences is a shrinking safe space, and there are just very few people that we would talk to honestly about whatever we think about politics and law and courts, etc. And a safe space, I think right now means a private space. I think it also means, basically like the fam jam and friends, and that's what's so constricting about living today. In the political climate that we're in. I'm sorry, it sounds really bleak, what I'm saying. As for what RBG could have done or had or whatever, I'm not sure what she had. I think she just lived in in a time which was so radically different in some ways and like horrifyingly similar in others, where she just probably had to assert her humanity over and over again. And I feel that minorities, women, groups, various groups have to do that even now, what with Sabarimala and all of those sort of things going on. So I'm not sure that we're there yet. So I don't know how we can describe what that safe space looks like per se.
I mean, but that's it. I think the idea of turning to your immediate circle goes back to the point you were making earlier, that civics is built out of its immediate community, so you need to insist on it. So I do think this is a fair point. Vakasha, I want to say more about it.
So I think, so to start with, I think one of the interesting things, given that we were talking about sort of RBG's conciliatory approach and how we view that, and I think just picking up on what Tara also mentioned, right, as in she was coming from a very different time at that stage, where if she had tried to maybe be more firebrand, I don't think it would have achieved what she wanted to do. And that's unfortunate that that's the case, that people have to tiptoe around those eggshells. But I think she was someone who very clearly charted out how she wanted to do it. So what's interesting is, on the one hand, she did have to maybe be more conciliatory or be more careful than she wanted, than she may have perhaps intuitively wanted to. But I think over the course of her career, if you see the way she handled her cases, the way she then handled being a judge, she had a particular way of going about this, even after becoming a judge, which shows that she kind of charted her own way eventually in this. Eventually it wasn't just about, her trying to be careful with things and kind of be pragmatic. Eventually there were parts of that approach which I think were very important to her. So I think this came up in the context of a couple of her decisions of the court, where you see she specifically said that I'm not going to try and go for a broad, sweeping, general attempt to kind of change things. But if instead we are able to, by the letter of the law, by the letter of what sort of a formalistic approach, also find certain solutions to these things which will have a transformative effect, then let's do that first, rather than immediately try to, re-up and change everything. Let's first fix these things which we can. And the interesting thing is that, and that was obviously the approach which she had taken with those two tax cases, which really sort of made her name for herself when it came to the tax and the social security case, which really made her name for herself on this whole issue of sex discrimination, where, funnily enough, she was representing a man in those cases rather than a woman. But it was a fascinating point that she was, able to bring up through all of that. And I think so. What we can perhaps learn from that is that, and again, this is a point which you also just mentioned, that times change. Now, her approach was the way to go about it during that period of time. It was perhaps the more appropriate and sensible way to go about those things which she wanted to achieve. And they've got us now to a point where we now have to either be doing things in better faith, but unfortunately, given, as Tara's again mentioned, the very depressing state of the world we're in, we do have to now start asking ourselves whether that approach is no longer going to work. In the context of, I think, what RBG was doing all these years, I think what she wanted to achieve through her approach, she was able to. But there is now perhaps a need to start looking beyond that. And this isn't just about, I think, the way women have to approach it. I think it's about any sort of a marginalized community. They have to all start thinking now about how assertive do you be? Because if you try and just sort of, try and get along with everyone and kind of get through it, some things will happen, but many very important transformative changes will not. Now, each movement is going to have to figure out where they're going to come from in that, how they can achieve that, whether that is going to be possible at this point of time. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. And in that context, the concept of a safe space, I think, will become very important, because one of the really big things happening right now in the sort of space dealing with protests in Delhi and sort of pan-India protests about things is every single activist is really worried about what's going on. They're worried about surveillance. They're worried about entirely innocuous things being converted and twisted into these bigger ideas of problems. And so if we look at, say, women who are trying to work on a lot of these issues, given there are so many really strong and intelligent women working on these kind of protest movements, for them, there's a lot of questions which are going to be asked about how they're going to advance the kind of things which they want to work on. Like, what is a Sudha Bhardwaj going to be able to do now after having been forced into jail? Like, she's been doing work which may not always on the face of it seem like it's directly, say, going to help women, but the work which she does is vital to do that. Even even if she's not necessarily fighting a particular case to help a woman or a group of women, the kind of values which she stands for is going to. So now when you put her behind bars, everyone who's working on that context is going to have to think about it. And it is if we think about all these problems which are now coming up with attempts to kind of push the envelope a little bit with the conversation on these issues in India, when we look at someone like RBG, we see that she perhaps also saw that there was these kind of concerns even back in those days, and that was why she charted her approach. Whether that approach is going to be the way to go forward is, of course, not necessarily true. And I think that'll be something which will be interesting to get Tara's views on and kind of explore going forward in this conversation.
Okay, this Vakasha, it's a very fair point. I mean, I keep saying fair point, but you know, I'm trying to understand what version of feminism makes sense for today. You know, and it goes back to this idea of the timing of justice. You know, and every point in time we wonder whether we're either too early or too late in what we need to do, and that's a very odd kind of position to be in because you're constantly checking yourself. My own personal favorite brand of feminism is Donna Haraway's idea of a cyborg feminist, you know, and he like in a manifesto for cyborg feminism, Donna Haraway talks about how you can completely circumvent this question of an identity which is associated with femininity into the world of cyborgs, because machines are as yet sexless and they may be taken by feminism, you know. And I keep thinking about the same question in the context of algorithms, which is how do you make algorithms more harmonious, more friendly? How do you make justice appear more humane? We know lady justice. I haven't heard of a man justice so far, and I think that's a good reason, if you ask me. So turning to like slightly less bleak things, I want to ask both of you about your favorite RBG cases, and please get into the facts because I am first of all extremely ignorant, and I'm sure others are in my position as well. So it'd be nice if you could get into some of your favorite moments from RBG's life. And I know you've alluded to her experience as a practitioner, her experience in law school, and her experience, you know, as a judge. Even while thinking about whether she was taking a conciliatory approach or formalistic approach or whatever brand of labels we want to add to that. So the question I want to ask both of you is really about your favorite RBG moments. Contemplate. I mean, feel free to pick any case you want. And talk through it, something that resonates with you personally. That'll be nice. So Tara, once again, shall we come to you and then go to Vakasha?
Okay, so can I talk about one personal thing from her life, just because I think it's really sweet, and then I'll talk about a case. One is her amazing husband, though I don't think that anybody should be lauded for supporting anybody in their profession and so on, but I'm in love with her love story. And I think that is something that really stands out to me, that he, in those times, was a guy who was happy to sort of, for his wife to take the limelight, and in fact, actively helped her. And arguably, she wouldn't have taken the limelight if he hadn't been the gregarious person that he was, and so on. So I love that story of partnership that they have going there. I think in terms of her views, in terms of her judgments, what resonates with me the most is her views on abortion rights. Apparently she had always been vocal about abortion rights. She even discussed them in her confirmation hearing. It was her clear view that neither does the government nor anyone else have any right to make any choices on account of a woman, but also that reproductive choice was actually a fundamental factor in women's productivity in terms of in terms of their economic contribution. And of course, their ability to regulate their employment and so on. And there was an attempt to restrict abortion law in Nebraska against partial birth abortions. And she joined the court's opinion in striking it down. That was a judgment called Sternberg versus Gathr, and I've read that so many times. And it was actually delivered on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which is, of course, iconic, the iconic judgment which gave abortion rights to women, reproductive rights to women. Yeah, so that would be two of my favorite things.
No, those are both exceptional points to pick up on, Tara, because I think the idea that women need to have their houses in order to do a good job is so weird, because clearly Trump's doesn't seem to have the same kind of obligation, and other political figures don't seem to have the same kind of obligation as well. And for you to pick that as your example sort of makes sense. It sort of allows us to understand where and when we need to give ourselves the rights and freedoms that are important to us. And I can't think of a better way of doing justice than that. So that she stood up for abortion rights in her confirmation hearing is super interesting. And soon after, we'll dig into this process a little more. But Vakasha, you go for it, and then we can come back to these threads.
So for me, the one which I find quite fascinating is that the case which I find with the judgment which she was involved with was one of her dissents was in Ledbetter versus Goodyear, and I think this is a very interesting one because this one it's an issue which I think we are going to continue to grapple with, not just in the US but elsewhere as well, because it was about basically the question of discriminatory pay for women. And what I really loved about the opinion she gave in this was that she very clearly required not just an assessment of the fact that pay discrimination between genders tends to be something which is there. It's all pervasive. It's been going on for a long time. She also looked into the issue of pay discrimination as a result of keeping pay details secret. And this is actually this is a bigger issue which I think applies also to general labor considerations across, again, not just in the US, but in India as well. Like one of the standard things which is done very, very sneakily by employers is always to keep this kind of stuff secret. And it not only ensures that you can underpay a lot of people regardless of their gender, but in particular, it helps them, disguise the way in which the pay gap actually comes into play. Because one of the things which people always try to use when they're arguing against the gender pay gap is, but people will be doing the same, they're obviously not doing the same work, they're being paid differently for different kind of things. But the problem is, until and unless you actually get that information and you're looking at all of that, you can't really make that assessment. And one of the ways in which employers can keep getting away with this is that secrecy. Something as big as the BBC was caught up in a huge controversy over this a couple of years ago, where again, they'd been keeping the pay amounts, what was being paid to particular, anchors and show hosts completely separate. And what was happening was that women who were doing incredible work, who were in some cases even more qualified than some of the men doing particular shows, were being paid far less. And some of it was, so like say the football stuff was relating what Gary Lineker was doing. He was getting paid higher than anyone else. But then, okay, sure, he'd been doing that for a while. It was related to the football thing, so you couldn't maybe make a comparison there. But where you had radio hosts doing the same kind of shows, having vastly different pay, even though there was no real difference in their experience levels or anything, this was huge. And the big problem is all of this stuff tends to be kept absolutely on the down low. And Ginsburg's dissent in Ledbetter versus Goodyear actually kind of goes into that specific thing. And what's interesting is, because we just talked about the fact that how Ginsburg was actually quite careful about saying, I do want to bring changes, but I'm not going to try and rewrite the law or rewrite what's there to do it. But what was fascinating was that the majority opinion in this case went on a very, very technical reading of the law to say that, so essentially what the conflict in this case was, this woman was being paid less. When she found out, she wanted to sue the company under the Title VII discrimination, the anti-discrimination clause, which they have in the US. But when she went to do it, the company was saying, okay, fine, we were, so you can sue us for, the disparity in pay for the last 180 days, from the time you made your complaint, because till then you didn't know, nobody knew that there was a discriminatory pay. And something as ridiculous as this was actually ended up being accepted by the court, because they were like, yes, you have to look at when the wrongful thing was discovered here, the wrongful discrimination, and the discovery we can only consider that the fact that this was wrongful came about when it was found out after having this stuff being kept secret. So it was a case where the court went by very formalistic ruling, and Ginsburg was, I think, quite furious with this. She explained also why she felt that, going by that very technical approach, which even she'd agreed that, you need to be formalistic sometimes about this, not get carried away, which, as we know, is one of the big problems with our Supreme Court. I mean, I think if anyone's looked at Anuj Bhavania's quoting the people, and you've seen the way PILs have become a complete mess in this country, is that, yes, we want the courts to be doing transformative justice, but there's a way to kind of go about it. And our courts have, the Supreme Court, for instance, completely lost its idea of how to go about these cases. And Ginsburg was someone who was obviously, if you're trying to argue for transformative justice in your country as well, it's going to be tough. But she always tried to find that line. And here she explained why that line had to be crossed, why you had to say that we can't go by this very formalistic approach. And in fact, she argued that even if you're looking at it by the letter of the law, there were ways to argue against it, because obviously the woman could not have known about the pay discrimination till earlier. It was kept secret. So how can you then, the wrongful act was still when the day the paid amounts were decided, not when she found out. And so basically, so the judgment she's written in that is really, really interesting, because it talks to us about how to approach these kind of cases where you can see that there's a formalistic technical issue which might prevent you from doing what seems obvious to be the right thing. But how do you decide that, okay, you know what, I'm going to discard that technical objection? Should we just do it the way the Indian Supreme Court says, Article 142, and we're done? No, I mean, there's a thought process which should go into it. And she gave us a way to kind of do that there. And what was particularly great about the decision was she also wrote an easy to understand version of her dissent for people to be able to read, which was again fascinating, right, for a judge to do. She obviously realized how important this issue was, and she's like, you know what, I don't want this opinion, this minority opinion, which is not going to be read and understood by the average American person. I want it to be written in a way where people can actually understand. So she wrote a separate thing explaining her minority opinion, and eventually she ended up, luckily, and the first piece of legislation which Obama passed after he came into power was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which was ensuring that this kind of stuff wouldn't happen again. Ginsburg actually helped draft that law. So, I mean, for me, that's the most fascinating case which she was on, because she did so much with it, even though she was in a minority there. She was able to, she made sure that she got her point across to the general public. She got her point across to the politicians, and then helped change the law in a way which didn't go beyond the remit, where she didn't end up having to sit on the lawns at the Supreme Court and, give a press conference in someone's house. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's
I can imagine. No, it's such a weird and unnecessary balance to strike, as Tara has also pointed out earlier. But I think to have done it with as much grace as RBG has did over such a long period of time is really remarkably noteworthy. But guys, I'm ladies and gents, I'm noticing that while we talk about how remarkable she is, the first thing we're noticing is her commitment to women's rights. And it seems to be a feature of how we think about feminism, that we evaluate a woman's commitment to women's causes, because this is an issue which I've noticed a lot with Indian lawyering as well, because there are women's issues, women's lawyers who work on women's cases, like child sexual abuse, family law, things like that. And that's really not a fair representation of someone's capacity to do legal work, right? So I want to ask both of you a question which is focused around maybe picking a case which has nothing to do with her. I'm wondering how to frame this, because it has lesser to do with her commitment to human rights and women's rights and more to do with her skill as a lawyer. And clearly this idea of conciliation has come up over and over again. But feel free to pick a case, and I know Vakasha, you spoke about a tax case earlier. If you want to talk more about that, it'll be interesting. But I'm wondering about the ways in which we can talk about that. Maybe another way to sort of frame this question, maybe which is slightly easier, is to ask what kind of cases you found most problematic for in our evaluation of RBG as an icon. Tara, you want to go first? There are two parts to this question once again. Sorry for being so winded and confusing. The first one is picking a case which you think reflected her lawyering capacity over and above her commitment to women's rights, in the way that any man might be judged, for instance. And second, about cases that you might have found problematic in her tenure, which you wish she did slightly differently. So, Tara, we'll start with you again and then come back to Vakasha on this.
Well, to be honest, in her lawyering, I actually can't think of any. I mean, the closest I can, and I haven't done a study of all the cases that she would have done, and I'm sure there were plenty, and I'm sure this is part of the problem. But equally, it's perhaps all right, because gender issues are mainstream issues, and it's okay that we're talking about them, and they're not reflective of any lesser kind of lawyering. And I'm sure that she did a whole length and breadth of work with the ACLU. But I can't think of anything in specific, except I suppose gender discrimination turned on its head in the Social Security case that Vakasha mentioned earlier, which was a case of a guy whose wife had died during childbirth and he was left with his child, and he made the brave decision at that time to take care of the child. He wanted to access Social Security benefits for a single parent, and he couldn't. So that was a case that she took to the court. Of course, what comes out of that case is to show that gender discrimination hurts everyone, because you put both genders and all genders in boxes that they don't necessarily always occupy. In terms of her sitting on the court, sitting as part of the bench, I think there have been quite a few cases that have been problematic.
That's a fine
Sorry?
point for a moment. I don't know what you were saying.
Go ahead. What did you? I didn't understand.
I lost a moment, so I was really.
Tara, I think you can go ahead. Badri's on mute, so it's fine.
No,
Okay.
I said I interrupted you by mistake. I was not sure if you saw the point you were making. But I mean, like, if I were, now that I've interrupted you, I might as well, like, I was just trying to notice the parallel between talking about
I think we've lost Badri.
we having like technical issues as usual.
Yeah.
That's because you're having a fun time in Leh while the rest of us are all working for a living, Badri. That's why.
Do you want to take it ahead for a non-gendered RBG moment, Vakasha?
I mean, I think so. Something I was trying to point out in Ledbetter as well, that it seemed to be a case which is only about gender, you might argue. We might think based on it, but actually it's not. And I think that's something which comes up so much in these cases which she dealt with. Because Ledbetter, as I said, it was about, it came up because of a woman being discriminated in pay, but she talked about the bigger issue also of pay discrimination being kept hidden. And that's a bigger labor rights issue. It's not just a women's issue, you know, and I think it's wrong to perhaps, many of these cases which people tend to think of as being women's issue cases, the principles involved are so much more than that. The moment you're looking at anti-discrimination law, those principles are going to be applied elsewhere as well, and you can't just to think of those, even if the case itself, the facts may deal with a gender-based issue. That's not all what it comes down to. Those arguments, the principles which are then held by the court, which are argued by the judges, which are argued by the lawyers, those are going to all be important for all kinds of discrimination cases. I mean, you know, in the Indian context, where this was very interesting to see was obviously the 377 case. When you look at the Chandrachud opinion itself on anti-discrimination and what it looked at in terms of how you have to assess the way you consider when there's a discriminatory effect. You're not just looking at a direct provision saying, oh, we're going to not let women do this, or we're not going to let the transgenders do that, we're not going to let the gay community do that. That's not the point. You have to look at the broader context of if a particular legislation is going to do that. Now, while that judgment is about Section 377, the principle which Chandrachud has articulated there, based on arguments raised by all the petitioners as well, that's going to be useful for any anti-discrimination case going forward, any case where an Article 15 violation is being argued. So I'm, first of all, like, I don't think I'm comfortable with saying that, you know, that when we're talking about these cases, we are kind of putting that value or a judgment on Ginsburg's opinions.
Exactly.
Having said that, I mean, there are cases, you know, because Ginsburg stood up for a lot of other things as well. One of the big issues which the US has been facing for a long time is attempts to gut the Voting Rights Act, right? Because there's a whole thing of how, you know, if you gerrymander enough and if you get enough black voters or Latino voters or people of color out of the picture, you can basically flip a lot of districts. You can ensure that the Republicans stay in power in a lot of places. So again, one of her very, very famous dissents was on that, where the majority of the court said that it's okay for I think it was, where was this? This was in, I can't remember the name of the state where it was, where they were trying to change. They actually already had in place a very good system for trying to make sure people couldn't get struck off the rolls. It required like some 3 different checks and balances. And then the legislature wanted to change that because it was, guess what, dominated by Republicans, goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, that's fine. And the idea was, And again, Ginsburg's dissent is great because again she looks at all of these issues. She's saying that when you've got a state which has built in these safeguards, when you've got these things in place, they should not be held unconstitutional. The state wants to remove it and change things, then it can go ahead and do that, sure. But why should those restrictions, which are things which have worked, which have shown that they're working to protect rights of people, why should those be removed? And there is no logical reason to do that. And and I think it's interesting because it's this whole we've seen this concept come up in a couple of Indian judgments, including in 377, where Nariman's judgment talked about this, which is that whole thing of non-regression, that you don't want to regress backwards towards certain views, and that's something which a court can adopt as a policy. And so I think the fact that Ginsburg made the argument for non-regression there on this issue again was something very useful. And again, now that could very well apply to a gender issue if you wanted to. But again, that shows you just why it's dangerous to say that, just because the facts of a case dealt with a gender issue doesn't necessarily mean that it is that you can pigeonhole it that way. And, so the issue.
It's not necessarily law.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, guys. I lost you for a moment, or you might have lost me. I'm not sure which one it is. But I was trying to highlight the idea that, whether we talk about gender rights or labor rights or fairness or discrimination or equity, all of them fundamentally have to do with whether the law looks at everyone the same way or not. And what should the law do when it doesn't look at everyone the same way? So I totally hear your points on, just the danger of looking at these cases as women's cases, because I think that's the worst thing we can do. That's the worst disservice we can do, both to lawyering as well as the idea of feminism in formal and informal channels. I don't know if that makes sense, but this is sort of how I'm evaluating this or understanding this one now.
So actually, Badri had asked the second half. The second half of Badri's question is still pending. So can I just talk about that? So Badri had asked, I think, what was like a problematic ruling or a decision that she gave on the bench. I think a lot has been said on her. One of the things that is constantly raised, for example, is that in her entire tenure as a judge, she had only one African-American law clerk, for example. So her views on race have been problematized, but there's nothing much to say what views she held one way or the other. But there is a judgment she authored, which is about the Oneida Indian Nation of New York, in which she applied the doctrine of discovery. Now, I don't know, Vakasha, if you know more about this doctrine of discovery, but basically it sounds to me like a justification for colonialism, which is you discover it and it's yours. So she delivered the opinion of the court, which basically said that the land didn't qualify as Indian territory. The land in question. So it said that just because you acquire it later doesn't mean you acquire tribal rights going back. And I think that decision, to her credit, she herself actually said that it was a decision that she regretted because of how it became precedent and was followed by lower courts, etc., to deny all kinds of rights to Native Americans. That was an example. Vakasha?
I was going to pick up Oneida because I think it's an interesting one to look at, because as you point out, one of the issues is that she, as you said, very limited number of black clerks, which is a strange one because, she's, when it's come to cases which have dealt with race, like for instance, the voting rights one, which was very clearly meant to target black voters. Those are, you can see that she's very clear-headed about how she's approaching it. So it was strange that, that wasn't something which translated into her more day-to-day kind of personal kind of life because a clerk is someone who's so important for a judge in that sense. And in the US, the way they select their clerks is again a very rigorous process. I struggle to believe that she would not have had, black candidates or people of color who might have been good enough. But again, I guess that's a tricky one to get into beyond too much, because again, it's not as though we have the record of who is there. It's a strange one. As I said, it's something which we don't really see in her judgments. But then again, unfortunately, that's sometimes something which happens. And I think the Oneida case actually, so there's because this was actually one of the the biggest kind of controversies around her. What's interesting is that after she died, there were a lot of Native American communities which actually came out in favor of her over not that judgment in particular, but they said her overall record was actually fine, whether it was people were part of Congress, whether it was spokespeople for various Native American communities. Because over time, if you look at the cases which she dealing with Native rights, she'd actually had been more favorable. So like there's one case where she held that she was part of the decision which held that the entire eastern half of Oklahoma is technically falls within is technically Native American, and therefore the federal criminal law jurisdiction doesn't strictly apply there. So that's huge. I mean, that was a huge decision to make, and one which had actually far bigger ramifications. I personally, I mean, I look, in terms of the way I've looked at, from what I can tell of Oneida, and I don't know if this is a simplistic view because I've kind of looked at it, without having enough of a background on US constitutional law. The thing is, what the facts in Oneida were that around 1794, there was a treaty, there were these lands which were there. Those lands were given away by the Oneida community, and then they later repurchased those. And then when they later, and this is 200 years later, when they repurchased it, and then they wanted to kind of, apply the same rights which they had elsewhere to it. And at a certain level, I mean, I kind of see what she's saying, right? The whole concept of the way sovereignty was looked at in terms of the US, the Native American states, was because you were looking at lands which were traditionally theirs, which were within their jurisdiction, which were part of what they were doing. And that's why sovereignty was still being exercised over those, where therefore US federal laws would not apply, US other laws would not apply. But if you're looking at a situation where you have, and it wasn't that it was the Oneida Nation, in fact, didn't even initially, I think, if I'm not mistaken, repurchase these lands. It was private Oneida, tribes people who purchased parts of those lands. Some of it was then later given over to the Oneida Nation. So, I mean, as I said, perhaps, maybe, I don't know if I'm coming from this from a wrong way, but honestly, like, I think her hands are a bit tied there to a certain extent, I'd say, because while one might say that maybe, so I think there were a few phrases which actually became a problem where the way she wrote about sovereignty, that those became an issue perhaps. Legalistically, I'm not sure if she could have done very much differently in that case, actually. In terms of, but I mean, that then takes us to another thing, that sometimes judges' hands may be tied when it comes to a case. They then maybe need to still at least consider the way they're talking about those things. If you're then going to talk about Native American sovereignty in the way it was ceded and lost, because at the end of the day, if we're looking at a 1794 treaty, it's hardly as though there was equal right. There was things were on an equal footing, and we know the way the US the US government, the way they went about these negotiations time and time again, where they went into them with bad faith and then reneged on things which they said. Perhaps there is an argument to say that the whole deal and the way it was done itself should be called into question, and on that basis you should say that therefore sovereignty should be considered here. But if that's not been fully established, if the case is going to have to go purely on a factual basis, I think maybe I don't quite know if she could have done it either way. But yes, maybe her language could have been different. There's a line where she talks about sovereignty. I can't remember the line exactly. And that was something which was picked up by commentators, by Native Americans at the time, saying that this was back in 2005, where they said, this is not the way we want you to talk about this. Even if you're going to rule against it, this is not how you should be referring to Native American sovereignty. So that's, I think, another useful thing for us to look at in terms of how, people who we look at as idols, people we look at as even doing the right thing in certain circumstances or not having a choice, there is always a certain way in which you can try to portray that differently. And perhaps that's something which is not wrong, I think, to expect of someone who is being viewed as an idol in that.
Is Badri back? Oh, he's gone off altogether. So actually, that brings us to like a really interesting question. I mean, what should prevail, right? Is it the law or equity? And it comes down to perhaps like what we believe justice really is, whether you believe that justice is can be achieved or is achievable outside the contours of the law, whether like equitable requirements dictate that you make a decision a certain way even when the contours of the law don't allow you to. Perhaps that's my thought.
I mean, I think that's where I think, where we were talking about that whole thing of how Ginsburg's approach was earlier based on trying to do things within the contours of the law. And that was why she was willing to make pragmatic choices, because she was like, if we pick our battles right within the contours of the law, we can achieve a lot of different things. But I think we're perhaps reaching a situation now, whether it's in the US, whether it's here, where we're realizing that for that to be the case, the board can't be stacked. It's that line which is that, you know, there's one side is playing by Marquis of Queensberry rules, and the other one is just picking up, is just fighting a street brawl. That's sort of the danger, is that you can try to go about that kind of approach where you're trying to look to do things within the contours of the law. You're looking to do things within that, as long as there is a level playing field, as long as there is a genuine attempt to kind of look at it. But I mean, just take what's happening with the Ginsburg replacement situation right now. There's no honesty. There's no consistency with positions which they laid down 4 years ago. Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham made statements on the record, and Graham said that you know, you can quote this back to me if you ever want to later, about why a judge should not be picked in the final year of a presidency. And now you're walking it back.
You know,
I mean, if that's what's happening at this point, then I mean, really, is it really, then what is the point of fighting within the contours of the law? Then you do have to start looking beyond it and saying that where there's a possibility to make a judgment in equity which is going to fix that, that should be done. The conversation on justice being beyond what's within a, you know, a constitution or a set of legislations is also something which has to be had, I think.
Yeah, you know, Vakasha, listening to both of you now, I feel like there are two important points here. One is for us as regular citizens to understand the evolution of law. You know, and I say evolution of law because principles and tenets of justice change over a period of time. And it's not always clear which ones we need to prioritize at what point in time. And I think there's quite an unfair obligation that we sort of place on judges in this context, you know, because the law is really made by all of us. And if we only turn to the Supreme Court for justice, then it's very difficult for us to ever be able to come to an understanding of what may or may not be the right thing. And that's what I'm hearing in both the comments that you made, because clearly we are talking about, on one side, her personal convictions, and the other side, the directions that law was taking in the course of its own journey, you know, outside of her own steps and how she chose to interpret the law, both as a Supreme Court judge. But all this said, I am personally certain that perhaps the present is at this moment, you know, and
that we kind of lost.
Needed, and the circumstances and a global pandemic and so many elections to be won. So it's a situation for most of us. You know, coming to the last 10, 15 minutes of our conversation,
I'll just step in. I think we lost Badri right now. He should be back. I am unsure what he was trying to say, because even for me, it was not very clear. But I think moving forward, since we have the last 10, 12 minutes left, what we can think of is, what do we take from her legacy and her journey into the Indian legal system? How do we want to approach the Indian legal system, looking at RBG's journey, or the way her decisions sort of revolved and shaped the judiciary system there? Who wants to go first? I would not. I mean, I don't want to call out one of your names, but yeah.
Tara, I think you should
go first, Vakasha. Go. I've gone first enough this time, right?
I think
I'm so sorry. I don't know if once again my bandwidth chose to throttle me before conversations did. I don't know.
Now you wait. Melita's asked a question.
Oh, fabulous. Go for it.
I think when we're looking at how to try and look at Ginsburg's legacy in India, I think it's important that there has to be exactly the kind of conversation we've had here today by people who've done even more of analysis of Ginsburg, to truly, I think, help people understand perhaps understand that, yes, she's someone who everyone talks about in a very, she was so cool, she was so this, like, I mean, yeah, you have to understand, she was a judge who went through a lot of these things. She's obviously done some things which were good, some things which we may not find right, some things which even she acknowledged maybe she could have done differently and could have perhaps achieved a better result with. The way this, I think, kind of ties back to what Badri was saying, but he got a bit cut off there, which was about where do we have to keep looking at judges to achieve that, or should we be looking at society as a whole to kind of achieve these outcomes of justice that we're looking for? I think the only way we can do that is by having conversations where we truly understand the kind of roles which judges are playing. So whether that's a Ginsburg in the US, it's a conversation we're going to have about Justice D.Y. Chandrachud in India. Again, someone who tends to be portrayed in a very positive light. But there are questions we asked about the legacy which he might leave, about the kind of judgments he's already delivered, whether those are. And sometimes we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to just accept that some of these judges are not going to be perfect, that they're not going to be able to always do the right thing or do what we want them to, even if they seem to be the kind of heroes who we think they are. Particularly, I think going forward, some of the things which I think are going to be important for us to look at are the way she was able to kind of bridge a divide in the court a lot of the time, the way she was able to make her dissents count, whether it was the way the Ledbetter decision actually was then enacted into law, whether it was the way she was able to create conversations about issues when she raised these dissents, which have, even if they don't necessarily lead to immediate change, they've helped have that discourse. And that's something which I think we have to consider, whether that's something which we want our judges to do here, which is scary when you think of a judge like Justice Arun Mishra being someone who's retired and passed a lot of judgments. Do we want him to start weighing in on the things which didn't go in his favor? Probably not. But I think that's a difficult question to look at. I think the only way to be able to actually really do an assessment of this legacy and really see how we can take these lessons forward is to do more of these kind of sessions where we talk about the way the decisions, the judgments which they worked on, the kind of work they did really is so important and is even flawed, because until and unless we learn to understand where the flaws also are in the way the courts are functioning, we're not going to proceed. One of the biggest problems in India is we've had so little critique of the way the Supreme Court has functioned for the last 20, 30 years, or at least mainstream critique, apart from the odd article or journal you have, and there's been stuff, but like on the whole, the public perception in the news media has always been, oh, the Supreme Court is this great bastion of justice. We're finally seeing enough work to counter that narrative. But it really shows us the importance of being able to do more of this kind of introspection. And I think the fact that Ginsburg has provided us a chance to look at the way a court it has to select its judges, the way it's going to actually affect the way the court's going to go forward. I think all of these are things which we really need to take forward from her legacy, and they definitely apply to it.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to sort of take away from all this, it's not so much to do with her per se, it's to do with her fan following or the cult of RBG, is that we should celebrate our heroes as well. I mean, there was Justice Bhanumati, who just retired, who was an absolute pleasure to appear before, because you had to have zero pretenses. Like you didn't have to put up some great show. You didn't have to be somebody very important. You just had to come to her with a case, and she wrote good judgments, concise judgments, and within the contours of the law, and she hardly spoke up and so on. And not that I'm saying that you have to be shy and retiring to be admired, but if that was her personality, but she delivered justice in every meaningful way, then we should perhaps be talking about her. And of course, there have been so many other judges. There's so many high court judges and so on. And I think icons are important, and I think it's important to recognize them, because I think people need to know what to aspire to as well, or one version of what to aspire to at least, whilst also problematizing things as Vakasha, of course, pointed out. So I think that could be an enduring legacy of RBG, which is to look for parallels in amongst our great judges who would be considered feminists or beacons for civil rights, and so on. I think another thing that she constantly spoke about was access to justice and civil rights, and I can't imagine a more important conversation today. And I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop, because someday the entire population of this country will realize that they don't have great access to justice, like that there is a hell of a lot that needs to be done in that department. And, when that happens, I think the shoe will drop actually at that point. So there's that, yeah.
Yeah, there's no question about it, because, I think in India, at least, we don't understand both what access means or what justice means, given that both of these words have so many different meanings in our everyday life and society, right? On one hand, it could mean access to capital, it could mean access to people, it could mean access to rights and access to dignity. We keep saying that India is a society which loves litigation, and going before the courts. And in the previous episode, we had Rohit Day talking about his book, A People's Constitution. And he was making the point that, often going to the courts is really the worst thing you want to do. Everyone in India understands that once you go to the courts, it's going to take forever, right? And we need alternate models for justice. And there's so much pioneering work happening in India on that front, with, say, people like Leila Ulapali, the Center for Advanced Mediation Practice, and so many fascinating, fabulous, top-notch lawyers, women who are just working in the shadows right now. But I really like the point that you were making about telling the stories, because my favorite woman judge by far would have to be Justice Leela Seth, who is Vikram Seth's mom. And my favorite work by her must be the children's book that she wrote on the Constitution. I would think that's far more important than anything she could have done on the bench, and I'm very hopeful to see more lawyers engaging in writing for public consumption, and I don't mean just writing about legal issues, but also the stories of things. Our friend Apurva Vishwanath has done a lot of work in this context, and she had a piece on not Article 37, Section 377, about Justice Singhvi revealing his preferences over a period of time and just coming to understand what alternate sexual preferences meant and his own journey in that process. And I think the work of women lawyers, male lawyers, women journalists, really all of us, to tell the humanistic side of the legal practice cannot be more important right now. So maybe as a closing question, the question that I want to ask both of you is, if you had to design a civics textbook right now for children, or if you had to design a coloring book for children, how would you, I don't want to say textbook, because textbooks are really the most boring form of understanding something, I feel. So can I just ask you both to say a few words about what your ideal storybooks on lawyering in India, and especially speaking about personal experiences of our women heroes, could look like? Maybe Vakasha, you could go first and Tara could close this. Mel can close this all off subsequently.
Yeah, I think this is something which you and I have talked about, the fact that we need more of these kind of conversations about getting people to understand the importance and the value of constitutional rights, the whole ideas that underpin the Constitution and the very concept of the democracy which we are to be in. And doing that in the way of trying to kind of communicating this to children would be a great thing to do. Of course, we don't want it to be something which is going to look particularly preachy. But I think one of the ways perhaps is to, I think one of the things which is going to be very important for this conversation to proceed in India at this point is going to be it's not just about being able to talk to people about freedom of expression, but I think it's going to be a lot about dignity. The ability to be able to express the value and the importance of dignity and autonomy is, I think, the most important way. And I think that's actually stuff which you can do quite easily through stories, where you make people's choices, the ability to make choices, important. You can throw that into a plot for a kid's story in many, many ways. If you do that, it's showing that even young kids should be given a certain degree of autonomy when it comes to making decisions, the way they're able to kind of go about things. I think that itself will start. You can do so many stories on this. And I mean, one of the interesting books which kind of does this to an extent, and which is very out of left field, might be A Series of Unfortunate Events. I don't know if you've read that or seen the show. It's a book series which kind of deals with these kids who constantly are being disbelieved by adults whenever they're telling them things about what's going on in the world. Like, they know they have this guy who's constantly trying to steal. They're a set of orphans. They know there's this guy who's trying to steal their fortune, and they keep pointing out to the adults that that's him. He's in disguise, but it's him, and he's trying to find a way to steal away. And this keeps happening over the course of 13 books. But what's interesting is that we have this constant thing about the value of listening to everyone and respecting people's opinions and what these kids are trying to say. Even if you have to get past the fact that they're children, the idea is that the adults need to start learning to do that. And that's something which I think you can do for a variety of different kind of viewpoints and a variety of different kind of groups which are facing that kind of thing. And you can do that very easily through story. And yeah, impressing upon the dignity of an individual and how that's something which is there regardless of which community you're from. Again, that you can do that through talking about, I don't know, animatronic or whatever, anthropomorphic animals also. I'm sure you can do that quite easily. And again, there are books which do that well. So I think, this would be something which would be great to look into. And I think if we're able to express those two values, we can do a lot, I think, with taking these ideas forward.
Vakasha, I think you have described your subsequent career choices. Please make these choices, because it's really not this obvious to most people that we can use animatronics to talk about the constitution, or lemony snicket to talk about people's constitutional journeys. But thanks for making the point. I think both of those would be fascinating. If you're doing that, please, can I help you publish it? I would be very fond of that kind of effort. But Sarah, what do you want to say about this? What would your storybooks look like?
That's a really mean question to ask, by the way, because it's a real curveball. Firstly, I would just like to point that out. But since I was thinking
it's not the first curveball.
Thank God Vakasha went first, because it gave me time to think about it. So Vakasha talked about dignity, but what I have been thinking a lot about these days is actually just kindness and empathy and it goes hand in hand with dignity, of course. So I think that one of the things that I constantly feel is missing is just the basic assumption that we're all humans. Hey, like I want to, knock you on the head and be like, me, that's who you're talking about when you're delivering a judgment or, doing whatever. Like if there's a Sabrimala issue or a triple talaq issue, that involves, triple talaq may not involve me. I don't want to take that over, but you know what I mean. So I think that interface is seriously missing. And since I was talking about Justice Bhanumati, one of the cases that she decided was the Jallikattu case, which is, that sport, the bull hugging sport down south. So it's been outlawed for like a long time, and there was a revival of it. That it happens every year. It's a traditional sport, and the participant has to ride on a bull with, and there are flags on the bull's horns which they have to remove, and that's part of the game. So I would probably want to write a children's book around that and create a world where the bulls take over and they decide not to Jallikattu the rest of us because they have empathy and we didn't while we were sort of hurting the bulls and so on. So cover issues of empathy and seeing difference as worthy of empathy, even as human, basically, in its own way. Yeah.
Well, it's obvious, veganism is the future, but I don't want to say veganism as much as plant-based, empathetic, human-first existence. But human-first is a dangerous thing to say in the world of Corona right now. So I don't want to make dangerous statements, But that said, the idea that we can humanize these cases by talking about the stories behind them and also flip up characters, right? Graphic novels were radically unique format to talk about justice, as was fiction. So I think to turn to both of those to talk about law and justice is super useful. Mel, what do you have to say about this? I can see like all the wheels in your mind turning on these matters.
I would I don't know about civics textbook or of any graphic novels. I was just thinking of like simple coloring books, but with like Lady Justice or Constitution, or like write an article and just have it in a coloring book, because I was playing with my niece today and they actually like coloring and puzzles, and I was thinking, why not have that? Because today I was playing with her and teaching her the names of our planets using a puzzle on the planet system. So why not have something like that instead of even textbooks? Because I think she would never take the textbook and start reading it, knowing her like for reading textbooks. So yeah, but
this, I like how our conversation is getting more and more basic, and I think that's the purpose of conversations such as these. And guys, we may actually finish on time, and I'm very grateful that you stuck through all of this despite severe technical issues, all caused by me. But that said, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We would love to have you back as many times as you would love to join us. And we can do each of these things in far more detail, like take each case and work with counterfactuals and really see whether we can approach liberal arts and humanities and justice with the same kind of focus that our country obsesses over when it comes to the science and math, I think that's a poverty of imagination. We lawyers have more imagination than that. It really shouldn't be used only for our practice, and that's quite a pity. So thank you so much for joining us today, for being such good sports. And yeah, you can say bye, and then we can all disappear.
Bye,
Say
guys.
bye, guys. This is your cue.
Bye.